So I'm really honored today to be joined here with Tedbora Berman, who is in Brazil right at this moment at the COP30, just shortly after the enormous march of Indigenous nations. And it's really exciting that you're there for that and also that you've joined us here. Thank you for coming. Tedbora, you're a little bit of personally for me an excitement because when I first got involved in activism was about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. I was living in Toronto,
Oh,
and yeah, I think you're based there, or you've been based there.
no, I'm in Vancouver, but I'm from Canada. Yeah, I used to live in Toronto. I did my degrees there.
It was one of our first big. I was working with, well, organizing, volunteering with 350.org in Toronto at the time, and one of our first big events, you were the speaker that we'd invited, and we were so excited. Oh, right, you're here. And so you've been sort of a glowing star for me of an inspiration in my activist. Is it a career? A career for I don't know. It's not.
I've been asking that question for over 30 years. I'm like, people
Yeah.
say your career is so amazing. I'm like, really? Is it a career? You just go from campaign to campaign. We're so lucky to be able to do the work that I always say, I get to do the work during the day about the stuff that keeps me up at night. And I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure how I figured out how to be able to do it every day, but I'm so thankful.
It's a thing to do it every day as well, isn't it? I really
Yeah.
understand that. Um, in those 30 odd years, you've been involved with so many different things, Indigenous led blockades and setting up forest ethics or Stand.Earth. And you're now the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Gosh,
You
that
know
was hard.
what? You're right on time because yesterday we actually formally changed the name to Fossil Fuel Treaty because it translates better in so many languages. And I think really the first 4 years we were trying to make the analogy and connection between nuclear nonproliferation and just shift the social norm around expansion of fossil fuels because, somehow, even though we've had 30 years of climate negotiations, the idea that you would actually need to stop expanding the production of fossil fuels seemed to catch people by surprise. And so we were really pushing this idea of non-proliferation, like stockpiling nuclear weapons. So it served its purpose. But when you're tired, it sure is hard to say over and over. So
It,
now that we're calling it, we've changed all the logos everywhere to Fossil Fuel Treaty.
Fossil Fuel Treaty. Fantastic. That is
Mhm.
easier. Well, yeah, I'm not gonna keep going, but because you've done so many things and I can't read through them all, but I'm just really grateful for you to be here, and I'll just pass over the space to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's so great to be here. I really have a deep admiration for people who have the courage to get out in the street and to organize. I've been doing both now for well over 30 years. It's funny because now I spend a lot of my time right now in diplomatic meetings with nation states, wearing a suit and walking through these halls. And I had a reporter say to me, how does it feel to have gone from the blockades to the boardrooms at one pot? And I said, oh no, you're misunderstanding what I'm doing. I'm doing both. We have to do both. We have to do everything we can. We need to have all the tools in our toolbox in order to address the crises that we face today. So this morning I spent 3 hours marching in 35-degree weather with the indigenous nations from the Amazon and hundreds of organizations from around the world, thousands of people who took over the streets of Belém here in Brazil today. It was incredibly beautiful, but as you can imagine, extremely hot, and I can't quite feel my feet. They're so tired. But we need tired feet. We need tired feet, but we also need to be doing the hard work of building solutions. And that's what we've been doing with the fossil fuel treaty for the last 5 years. And also, so building a pathway for solutions, but also trying to understand how to build an inside and outside strategy, a growing movement around the world that will create the political space and social license for countries to do the right thing, but also specific ideas at the table with these countries to get out of the logjam that they're in. Many of the countries that we're working with in the global south are drilling for more oil or fracking for more gas just to feed their debt. And they're, even if they wanted to, it's very difficult for them to stop alone. And that's why we actually need new international cooperation, new financial mechanisms. So I know many of you have been working on the fossil fuel treaty for a long time. It's one of the demands I see often around the world in different people's movements. And so I thought what I would do is take the time to explain to you where it's at, what it's actually going to look like when it becomes a fossil fuel treaty, and why we're in Belém, and what the next year is going to look like. So you have that information. So I'm gonna just quickly share my screen. I've prepared some info for you. Okay. Can you give me the thumbs up if you just see one image right now and not on my messy screen? Great, thank you. Good, then I've done it right. Okay, so let's take a look at where we're at. We're 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and emissions, as you know, continue to rise. Now, they have slowed, and I think there is a legitimate argument to say that if we hadn't signed the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, or if 190 countries hadn't signed the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, emissions would have risen faster. I think that's actually true. And I think that we'd be more on a trajectory towards a 4 to 6 degree world than currently the policy modeling says, which looks like more of a 2 to 3 degree world. Obviously, completely unacceptable. And there's questions about whether it's really 2 to 3 degrees given the feedback loops, and we keep learning so much about what's happening on methane, etc. However, 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and a lot of people here are saying, shockingly, at COP30 in Brazil, that we're on track. What's new in the climate conversation after 30 years is the conversation about fossil fuel projects and fossil fuel production, because of many of you around the world, and of course, many Indigenous nations that began that conversation, and frontline communities who were impacted by fossil fuel projects. So today we know we're on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal than the world can ever burn and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement by 2030. So let me say that again. We're on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal than is consistent with a 2 degree target, let alone a 1.5 by 2030. What we build today will be what we use tomorrow. So the idea that countries are only supposed to commit to emissions reductions while allowing production to continue is absurd. It's an astonishing form of hypocrisy that has been allowed to continue for 30 years of policy negotiations. And that's what the fossil fuel treaty is designed to address. Meanwhile, we know 1 person a minute is now dying due to lethal humidity. And fossil fuel air and smoke from wildfires. We know what was signed. And they will experience extreme heat, water, and food shortages, and many other impacts if we allow this to continue. They will leaving the renewable energy. We need a work plan on fossil fuel phase out. We actually are in a pretty good moment in history where we have double the investment of renewable energy than we did last year in fossil fuels. 2 trillion in renewable energy, only about 1 trillion in fossil fuels. That's great. But the problem is that renewable energy is not displacing fossil fuels and fossil fuel production. It's just adding to it. The atmosphere doesn't care how many solar panels we build. The atmosphere cares how many fossil fuel projects we don't. And we cannot continue fighting project by project, pipeline by pipeline. We need to create pathways, solutions pathways, so that we are stopping expansion all over the planet in a time frame that will save millions of people. So we need a work plan. So where are we at? Fossil fuel treaty, as many of you know, is based on the idea of 3 pillars. First of all, ending expansion of fossil fuels, non-proliferation, ensuring a fair phase out, so cooperation between nation states on who gets to produce and how much, that is based on equity, need, and fairness, and a just transition, making sure that we're not out of the pan and into the fire, literally. I'm hearing a lot from Amazonian leaders and Indigenous nations here in Brazil about the impacts of critical mining. And we see that from Canada to Africa to Latin America, all over. And let me just be clear, we do need renewable energy and we need electrification. And that will require some critical mining, but we can do more closed loop and circular systems. So we're recycling more minerals that are on the surface of the planet. We need to advocate for that legislation. And we can also ensure that the mining that happens is respectful of Indigenous rights, respects also biodiversity hotspots, etc. One thing you need to understand is the fossil fuel industry is using this concern about critical mineral mining to say that fossil fuels are better. Don't believe them. Make sure that you're talking about it. Fossil fuels require continued dependency and continued mining. The clean energy economy does not. That's why fossil fuels require 550 times more mining than clean energy. That is critical. 550 times more mining than the clean energy economy. And that's some of the issues we have to look at under the just transition bucket, and to encourage, again, countries to cooperate, to make new rules and new structures. So participating nations in the fossil fuel treaty are on the rise, thank goodness. We launched, of course, in 2022. We had 2 countries join near the end of 2022, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. We had a sweep of countries join 2023 and 2024. And now even in the last year, we've seen more countries joining. We now have 17 nation states who have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty, including big countries who are fossil fuel producers like Colombia. Colombia is the 6th largest coal exporter in the world. They have joined the fossil fuel treaty and are deep in helping to design what the treaty will look like. In part because we know investing in new fossil fuels and infrastructure is a moral and economic madness. So why do we need a fossil fuel treaty when we already have a Paris Agreement? There's actually no issues, very few issues in the world that only have one treaty. Nuclear has many, different treaties to address different aspects of an issue. The fossil fuel treaty will address the production work plan. It'll be a companion to the Paris Agreement. And let's not forget that the Paris Agreement, while critical for emissions reductions and demand side measures and encouraging countries to set their own work plan to reduce emissions, doesn't even include the words oil, gas, or coal or fossil fuels. Because of many of you, because of movements around the world, we've changed the conversation on climate change in the last 5 years. And many people said to us, what do you mean you're trying to say the F words? And we said, we don't even have the words fossil fuels in the Paris Agreement. And at that point, there hadn't been any discussion in the climate negotiations for 26 years about fossil fuels. Now they're at the forefront of the climate conversation. But right now, we're not getting the traction that we need on actually getting a work plan for managed decline. And that is being developed inside the fossil fuel treaty. The treaty now has support of 4,000 organizations in 120 countries, many indigenous nations, cities and subnational governments, individuals. And if you want to support the treaty, you can work in any of those ways. Our small secretariat at the global level tries to provide draft motions for city councils, structures for parliamentarians to join, information for scientists, etc. We also have a corporate program now because so many banks and other institutions, ones that are actually declining fossil fuel investment, by the way, we have very strict corporate criteria, are starting to join. Every major faith institution in the world has now endorsed and signed the fossil fuel treaty. The movement really started by leaders in the Pacific Island nations, and now it has grown significantly. So we are now both a campaign and communications hub to provide information to you and to those 4,000 organizations in 120 countries who want to work on the fossil fuel treaty. But we are also now a diplomatic secretariat to the 17 nation states and growing who are designing the treaty and laying the foundation for negotiations. We're very excited to say that these nation states are now collaborating under the lead of Colombia. This is the former Minister of Environment, Susana Mohammed, who actually joins us now as a special envoy for multilateralism at the Fossil Fuel Treaty. The Colombian government has now announced that they are going to host the first ever diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out in Colombia next year in April. This is historic. It will be outside the UN system. The UN system is riddled with fossil fuel lobbyists and countries who stand to benefit from increasing production, like the United States and Canada, Australia, Norway, and of course, Saudi Arabia. These countries have been holding back any real binding agreements between countries on fossil fuel phase out. Like with landmines, this will be a diplomatic conference outside the UN system. It'll be a build it and they will come model. Countries who are committed to high ambition are going to be coming to it. We would never have the landmine treaty today if Canada hadn't hosted the Ottawa Convention. And this is that historic moment. Colombia hosting the first ever diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out in April. We expect 40 to 50 countries to attend. We've been using other treaties as models to learn from what's good and what's bad in those different models and pathways for treaties. On our website, you can find a lot of this analysis if you're curious. We've learned so much from the different treaties and honestly, so much of what we don't want to do. The fossil fuel treaty will be binding. It will have binding agreements. It will start with a small group of ambitious nations. It will not be by consensus. It'll be voting rules. And that will ensure that countries who stand to benefit from increased fossil fuel production will not be able to stand in the way. Here in Brazil at COP30, we're hearing a lot about a roadmap on fossil fuels, which is great. They're using our language because we've been so successful in the last several years. But a roadmap, a true roadmap on fossil fuels that is built on equity, on justice, on leadership from countries in the global south that has timelines and that has commitments and that is binding is being built under a fossil fuel treaty, which will be a companion to the Paris Agreement. So far, the roadmaps being discussed within the UNFCCC process here do not have binding commitments. They're based under commitments that have already happened, with a concern that we have around a focus on sustainable fuels as a way to get out of fossil fuels and a continued language around unabated fossil fuels being phased out while abated fossil fuels are fine. That's a loophole that you need to be aware of. Abated fossil fuels just means that they're doing bad math around offsets and carbon capture and storage, which doesn't work while allowing fossil fuel production to continue. So yes, progress can be made here in Belém, and progress is being made on the fossil fuel treaty, but we have to be wary of fake progress. We have to support mechanisms that are being proposed that have equity and justice at their core, new trade, tax, and debt relief mechanisms between countries that ensure that there will be support for countries in the global south to move away from fossil fuels and to ensure that Indigenous rights and human rights are at the basis of any new treaty. The fossil fuel treaty has been working with Indigenous nations and Indigenous associations and is now commissioning legal research to try and understand how we can build a new type of treaty that has Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous law proposed at its core. But let me be clear, our Secretariat cannot write a treaty, and we cannot even negotiate a treaty. We can make recommendations to the countries who are now at the table, and that's what we will be doing. But we can do it and ensure a strong treaty only if everyone digs in. And that means you as well, because we're going to have strong advocacy outside as treaty negotiations begin next year and likely continue for at least a full year. We need to be ensuring that our voice outside is as loud and louder in some ways than the negotiations on the inside, to make sure that the reality of a fossil fuel treaty that is being built reflects the concerns that you've all addressed around the world as you do your work, marching in the streets and calling for climate justice. So thank you for having me, and I hope this update was useful for you.
Thank you so much, Tezpora. That's fantastic, and exciting to hear some of what you're working on. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to take some questions from the other attendees. So if you've got questions, folks, please either put it in the chat or into the Q&A feature, and I'll be looking in both places. And also to say on that, I'm not going to be like really hard on it, making sure you've got a question. So if you just want to sort of say something and then, you know, says Bora can riff off that or something like that, then you can also take the space. And in addition, please let me know somehow whether you would like to say the question yourself or whether you want me to read it out. So maybe just say in the chat or in the question, say me read or speak it or something like that, and make that clear. So a question for you that I have is, with all of the clarity around like the dire situation that we're in, and it's been there for years, and all of the climate pledges that are being made, um, and the UN Secretary General saying it is madness to do any new fossil fuel projects, and yet they're still going for it. What's the logic that's being followed here? Is it madness? Is it collective psychosis? Or is there something that's driving all of these the projects that are still going, like people are still drilling for?
It's a really good question. I've been thinking a lot about it, trying to understand what are the barriers to moving forward. Look, in every country I've talked to, every company I've talked to, and I've met with the CEOs of most of the major oil companies, they'll say the same thing. We know we need to phase out fossil fuels, but it can't be done overnight. And our fossil fuel seeing is that everyone knows that we have to use and produce less, but they all want to be the last barrel sold. They all think that theirs are going to be okay. And many of them have justifications for it. The Canadians say, well, we have better human rights, therefore our oil is better. They're Canada's, so ours is better. We're going to do carbon capture and storage, which, because we know after billions of dollars of carbon capture and storage funding and subsidies around the world, we currently capture about 0.2% of the world's carbon. It's absurd. But that's the other justification is a lot of people really believe that technologies will clean it up, that it's okay if we continue to increase production because we're going to reduce emissions per barrel. We're going to make it cleaner and cleaner. And once we can have direct air capture at scale, I'm told, then we're just going to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. Again, billions and billions of dollars to do that. And the fact is, we don't need to do that. Renewable energy is now cheaper. Battery storage has reduced in price since the Paris Agreement was signed by 90%, solar by 50%, wind by even more than that. We now know we can do that at scale if we do efficient energy efficiency and renewable energy and electrification of transport. We can get rid of most of the fossil fuel use that we need. I also think it's important for people to understand that we don't need to replace 100% of the fossil fuels. We only use 34% of the fossil fuels that are produced for heating, transportation, and electrification. That's because 66% is just used in the system of making more fossil fuels. 50% of the ships moving around on the planet today are just to move more fossil fuels around. It's the most inefficient energy system that could have been created. But it was created that way because every barrel that's produced, someone's making money. Not a lot of people, a very small number of people, but they're making a lot of money. They're making $2.8 billion a day in pure profit every day for the past 50 years. This is the most profitable industry on the history of the planet. So that's the other reason why. Even though they know what's happening, they stand to make enormous amounts of money if they can grandfather in some more projects. And if they see the writing on the wall, but they're just trying to get their projects in. They're just trying to get their money made. So that's the companies and the countries in the global north who are responsible for the majority of expansion. The countries in the global south have bigger barriers. They're doing it because they feel like they don't have a choice. They have to keep their, look, let's take one country. Let me think, Malaysia. 70% of Malaysia's GDP is dependent on fossil fuel exports right now. So if they just stopped exporting today, for example, they would have a crisis. Their hospitals would close, their roads would close. And so if we're going to help that country reduce fossil fuel production and exports, then we need to relieve some of that. Why is this happening? It's happening because big wealthy companies are shoving capital at countries in the global south to get them dependent on fossil fuels. Because it's not about technology, it's not about turning the lights on in Asia and Africa. It's about dependency. It's about profit and dependency and ideology. The fossil fuel economy has never been just about technology or energy. It's been about dependence and elitism from the very, very beginning, and domination of peoples, of cultures, of nature, and a devaluing of nature and frontline communities and Indigenous people. This is an economy that was designed to be about power in every sense of the word power. And that's why the solution is not just a solution of decarbonization. It's a solution of democratization, democratizing our energy system and decolonizing our energy system.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question of my own before I open to the floor. And just a reminder to people who are putting questions into the chat, if you just send a message along with your question saying, I want to ask it, or please read it for me. That would be really helpful. So my other question, or it's just a request really, but you mentioned this conference coming up in Colombia um, about ending the fossil fuel era, and I'm curious. I've also heard outside of the United Nations, there's an initiative, the Union of Original Nations, um, and other projects like these that are building power outside of the UN and outside of the sort of existing power structures that are so entwined with the fossil fuel industry. Amazing to think it's almost 3 billion a day being made in profit by fossil fuels, and just where that is going. But yeah, so I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about where is this power building, and where, what do we look to there?
It's really interesting how quickly everything is changing. I would have said probably a year ago in the South Pacific, they hold so much moral power, actually. I don't know if people realize a lot of the progress that we've made on climate so far is because of the leadership of South Pacific island nations, some of the tiniest, poorest economies in the world, the most vulnerable people to climate change, but they are so this is an existential crisis for them, and they were the first to feel it with sea level rise and having to relocate people, and with a tremendous increase in violent storms. I've had the great joy of being able to spend quite a bit of time in the South Pacific as I was building the fossil fuel treaty over the years, and learned so much from their leadership. We wouldn't have even the idea of loss and damage in the negotiations if it wasn't for Pacific Island nations. We wouldn't have the International Court of Justice recent opinion saying it is illegal, literally illegal from international law to expand production at this moment in history. We wouldn't have so much of what we have as a structure today to be able to move forward on climate policy and international negotiations. And so they really built the idea of the fossil fuel treaty. The first 12 countries to join were from the Pacific. And they started socializing it around the world, but now it's growing. We have, Pakistan as a participating nation, Colombia, Timor-Leste, a lot of countries a lot of Caribbean island nations have joined up. But what's really interesting also is in our ministerial meetings and senior official technical meetings on the fossil fuel treaty the last 6 months, we're seeing 10 other countries sitting as observer nations, and some European countries coming in as observer nations who are talking about joining the treaty now. Haven't yet, but talking about it. And so the block of nations is growing. It's not from one region of the world. And I've seen more interest probably since President Trump did his UN speech and called it all climate a hoax and said it wasn't possible to find solutions. And it's almost like that poisonous polemic is creating a leadership. I've heard several countries who I didn't expect to hear this from, big European countries saying to me, you know what, now we know which side we're on, and we're not that side. We'll come to Colombia to this fossil fuel phase out conference. And so that's exciting. But the other thing is that I'm hearing countries especially in Europe, talk about fossil fuel phase out as an energy security issue for the first time. And I think that's because, look, many of these countries went from being dependent on Putin for gas to being dependent on Trump for gas. And they started realizing, oh, wait a minute, this is so vulnerable. And it's true, because again, the fossil fuel economy was built to create dependency and domination. So if you want to be independent, if you want to be resilient, actually, you need to build your own infrastructure. You need it to be diversified across the landscape, and you need people in your communities to own it, not someone from far away who's making a huge profit. So this idea that fossil fuel phase out is now becoming, kind of an energy security issue is really exciting. So I think we're going to see leadership from all over. I think really we're going to see a lot of leadership from South Pacific Island nations, but also Colombia is really at the forefront here and proposing this conference, and starting to design it. But it's not going to be one conference. Like if you look at the pathway to other treaties, it was a series of diplomatic gatherings over a year or two that set the table for actual negotiations for a new treaty and kind of built the grouping around it. So I expect Colombia will be the first of many fossil fuel phase out conferences.
All
Sorry,
right.
I'll try
Well,
and be shorter with my responses. I'm not very succinct, but I'm running on no sleep and
no, it's great. It's really good to hear all that you're saying, and I'm encouraged to hear it, and a lot of respect for Colombia for getting that going as well. I've got a question from Adrian, who says the Church of England has endorsed the treaty. What should be the next step or steps? It's the sort of what more can be done question.
Well, first of all, I mean, we don't have all the answers at the Secretariat, but I can look and see what others are doing in their campaigns and give you some ideas. But we think of this as a distributed network campaign. So we're trying to create resources and information for you, but how you decide to campaign on the fossil fuel treaty, no one owns the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. No one owned the idea of a Paris Agreement. So first of all, make it your own. What's going to work with your community for your community to get excited about it? The idea behind the campaign is to constantly have awareness, media moments, and building a bigger tent. So are there other communities of faith? Are there others in the businesses in that community? Like, where can you grow support is what I always tell people. Map it out. And is that through public events? Is that through sign-on letters? Is that through petitions? Is that through going door to door? When you look at the site, you can see you can sign as an individual, and over 1 million people have signed as an individual. You can sign as an institution. There are sign-on letters now for artists, scientists, businesses, and those numbers matter. I get countries coming to me saying, you save 1 million people, how many in my country? Or, oh, you got 800 parliamentarians from which parties? And like they're interested. And that gives them space. I've also had countries saying, do you have any of those 3,000 scientists from my country that I could talk to and who might stand up on a podium with me? What about doctors? One politician said to me, if I endorse the fossil fuel treaty, do you have people from the health community that will stand with me and say it's a good idea? So the campaign is about building social license and political space, and how you decide to do that, it is up to you. But two important things. One is make sure that your narrative around what you're saying about the fossil fuel treaty addresses the three pillars. Make sure that equity and fairness is at the base of it. And two, tell us what you do. We can't, bring it all together and put it out in our newsletters and through our media feeds, et cetera, to show that the campaign is growing around the world if we don't know what you're doing. And that's happened to me before, where, I had someone come up to me and say, hi, I just got Hawaii to endorse as this is a bad example because actually I did know Hawaii was coming, but it's an example and I'm too tired to think of another one. But, it happens all the time where someone will get a state, a province, a city, and they'll do all this work and they'll pass a motion at a council, and then they'll never tell us. So we couldn't put out a press release if we don't know it's actually happening. So tell us, make sure you tell our campaign director. It's all available for you, and all the contacts are available for you online. We are also going to try and provide key moments for the movement and the network to engage. So if there's a political moment, we will let you know. Like if there's a moment, like actually we need everybody to write to whatever, this country or the IMF or this country, then we will let you know, and then we'll bring the movement together on those particular goals.
Fab, thank you. I've got a question from Carol, who's asking me to read it out, saying there's enormous subsidies for oil and gas production. Is removing these subsidies part of the interim plans towards these radical changes that are needed?
Yeah, absolutely it is. You know, it's we've talked a lot at the treaty table with the ministers about various mechanisms to bring finance forward to help countries shift away from fossil fuels. Subsidies comes up a lot. Like, let's get the wealthy countries to commit to move that money where it could actually reduce fossil fuel production instead of help increase fossil fuel production. The amount of money is enormous. It's terrifying. If you look at the IMF reports, it's somewhere around $7 trillion a year. It's absurd. We're paying the wealthiest companies in the world to do this using taxpayers' money. And actually, if you look at the numbers in the last couple of years, it's gone up, not down. And I think that's because different nation states are trying to keep their industry alive. So they know that this year, 1 in 5 cars sold on the planet will be electric this year. They know that the demand is going to go down for fossil fuels. And so they're trying to keep their industry competitive, even though renewables are cheaper, et cetera. So they're subsidizing more. So under the actual treaty, looking at this different mechanisms under the treaty, we're looking at trade, tax, debt relief. We're also looking at issues around subsidies. So there would be agreements between the nation states at the table at the fossil fuel treaty on subsidies, and potentially a rerouting of some of those funds towards countries in the global south in order to help them transition.
And you just mentioned debt relief there. And there's a question around debt relief from, well, it's like, how important is debt relief versus how much do you see the sort of the campaign of debt refusal coming up, where especially the global south countries just say, actually, the debt that you've put on us, we don't even believe in it, we're not going to act as if it exists. And
it's increasingly a conversation here in the international space. And in fact, there's also one of the critical pieces is audits of debt. So a new government will come in and they'll be told you have this much debt, and it's strange to accept it. And I can't remember the name of the organization I was talking to, but they were telling me about how a comprehensive debt audit had been done in Ecuador. And it turned out that like 60% of the debt was fraudulent, made up over the years and put onto the balance sheet. So you need to have, we need to have debt audits. There should be debt refusal, but we also, and it's not, we also should be looking, and it's one of the things we looked at this year with some experts from the Caribbean as an example, and the report is up on our website under resources, fossilfueltreaty.org. We looked at debt swaps, debt for renewables, et cetera. And those are interesting mechanisms that are all being explored under the treaty. One thing you should know is that right now, in order to relieve debts, for example, IMF loans and grants, this year, the IMF required several countries to say they would increase fossil fuel production in order to get their loans and grants. So there's so much in the system that needs to be changed. And in order to change those systems, often you need multiple countries committing to change those systems. And those are all things that are being reviewed. The lawyers and the finance experts and the researchers who are providing information to the countries at the table of the fossil fuel treaty.
got a question from Annie. Um, Annie, I'm bringing you up in case you'd like to ask it yourself. Um, what key lessons from the Pacific Climate Warriors and other Pacific organizers did you take early on?
Such a good question. And it's almost hard to answer because there's so many. So I'm just going to think for a sec. The importance of dialogue, of truly listening and creating the space to do that, um, has been a core lesson that I've learned from the Pacific. The persistence, dedication, but doing it with humor and kindness is I think a particular piece of what I've learned from Pacific warriors. And also that doomism, despair, that's a privilege. That's a privilege that people who live in those regions, they don't have. And and that's and I think that's something especially important for those of us in the global north to remember. But I would say most importantly, it's the importance of culture. A lot of the Pacific artists that I'm working with now, what they've said to me, there's an amazing group that's formed called This Is Our Home. I think you'll find them on Instagram under Project This Is Our Home. And they said to me, it's great. You're creating these new ideas, you're talking to people's heads, and that's really important. But we're going to open their hearts. And if you don't open the hearts with culture, with art, with community in that way, then you'll never see the movement grow big enough for substantive change. And they talk a lot about how other social movements throughout history always had this a really robust arts and culture arm, and how we don't really in the climate movement, not as much as other movements in history. And so they've started going around the world performing and singing and telling their stories um, as a way to campaign for the fossil fuel treaty. And it's incredibly beautiful and really powerful. It changes the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I got a question of, are you working with the campaign to stop ecocide and making ecocide
Yeah, they're
international?
amazing. And the two concepts are so entirely compatible. So we do what we can to support each other, to invite each other to speak on different events, and behind the scenes talk through some of the diplomatic strategy. Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely a campaign that I hope you're all supporting.
And then a question of, are the protests at COP getting through? Like, do you get a sense that there is something changing here? Um,
It does bring an important sense of urgency. It's definitely brought Indigenous rights and human rights more to the forefront of the conversation, which I think is really great. Um, but I have to say, I'm a bit of a skeptic around how much can be achieved in this process because of the design of it, right? Like, this is a consensus-based process that where countries like Canada, my own country, the US, Saudi Arabia, have the capacity and have always had the capacity since Kyoto 30 years ago to water down any timelines or targets or binding mechanisms that might actually stop the expansion of fossil fuels. I also, let's not forget that the data this year from Kick Polluters Out that they have crunched shows that 1 in 25 people here work for the fossil fuel lobby. 1 in 25 people. It's a bigger delegation than any country in the world other than Brazil. And so it's hard not to be cynical about what's happening here, and to be I in some ways sad that all of those Indigenous people needed to literally walk. Many of them that I've met here walked for days. out of the forest in order to come here and block the gates of COP. And I'm glad they're here, but it shouldn't have to be this way.
Yeah, agreed. And I found it very difficult when I was in COP. So power to you to be there. Um, Jill, I see you've got your hand up. So I'm gonna invite you. Um, where are you? There you go. If you would like to come off mute, you should be able to.
No, no, that was a mistake. Sorry.
Ah, okay. Okay, then I've got Aaron so let me find Aaron. Here we go. Aaron, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. Hello. I have one thing that I think transcends everything. I really think this is a big question, that should we be leaving the fossil fuels in the ground because they contain so much ancient sun energy to be able to get us through the next ice age? Because I don't, even with the amount of nuclear energy and power stations we've got at the moment, that they're insignificant. We would literally be in the beginning of an ice age now if it was not for fossil fuels, I believe. I mean, that's just debatable, but I think that is the main question, the overriding question that we should be asking of all our governments and everyone is, will the human race get through the next ice age without fossil fuels? Because we're depleting them at too high a rate. Thank you.
There is no question that we need to leave the remaining fossil fuels in the ground from a scientific perspective. I would argue, though, the primary reason is that when we use fossil fuels and burn them, they end up being trapped in our atmosphere. 90% of the emissions today that are trapped in our atmosphere, causing the sweltering blanket that is causing the fires and the floods and the storms increasing around the world, and the lethal humidity. 90% comes from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And we don't need them anymore. We have enough fossil fuels already under construction on our surface of the planet to use for the uses that we haven't figured out how to replace, and to use while we transition to a renewable energy economy. We can now, with existing technologies, get the majority of the energy that we need for heating, for electricity, and for transportation cheaper and safer from the sun and the wind. And the only reason we're not doing that is in large part because of greed and the political power and control that the fossil fuel industry has on so many of our governments.
Thank you, Spora. We're coming to the end of our session. I got just a final question about, and it might not be out in your area at all, but the attacks that Trump is currently putting onto the boats in the Caribbean, claiming it's about drugs, but how much is that to do with Trump intending to steal Venezuela's oil and get more of that?
Probably a lot, or critical minerals or water. I personally believe that all of the different strategies that we've been seeing Trump employ are about so strange. There's a duck inside the building right behind me. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but it's just the strangest thing. All of a sudden, a little bit of nature. The ducks agree that we can. Yeah, it's very weird. All of the strategies, Greenland, and the weirdness around Greenland, Canada around being the 51st state, the trade and tariffs, they're designed to evoke fear, to build power. And if you look at the strange things that he's doing, especially around Greenland, especially around with the boats, this is either about critical minerals, or it's about oil and gas, or it's about water. It's less about oil and gas, I would argue, than critical minerals, because the US is sitting on the Permian Basin, which it's now exploring as quickly as it can. The Permian Basin is one of the largest sinks of oil and gas in the world. And the US has increased oil production since the Paris Agreement was signed by about 40%. And now is growing, responsible for about 67% of the growth in oil and gas production in the world. So they cut a lot of their own, but they know they're going to need a lot of critical minerals. And I think that the race for critical minerals is going to change the geopolitical landscape significantly, and so is water. Water is becoming a scarce resource, and all the world leaders know it.
I've got a final question that we just squeeze in, coming from Carol, asking about plastics. The plastics seem to be such an important part of life in these days. Is there the technology to substitute it, or do we need to keep digging up fossil fuels in order to be able to make plastics?
We already have more than enough plastics and fossil fuels on the surface of the planet to use and continue to recycle. But also we have alternative options for a lot of the uses of plastics. There is no use case for more supply and expansion of supply of fossil fuels at this point. I mean, some of the trickiest uses are probably aviation. That's only actually 2% of emissions. It's a very small amount, and there's already some solutions. There's a company in British Columbia that's now flying an electric plane, small flights, short hauls, but they're flying them. And so, you know, we can replace most fossil fuel uses, and certainly plastics is not a good argument. Now, the industry is dramatically increasing the plastics supply in order to continue to create demand for fossil fuels. And you see that in their own strategy documents. A lot of, from an economic perspective, it used to be that demand for energy or fossil fuel use products was what drove supply. But now that's changed. And you've seen a lot of people even publicly acknowledging that within the fossil fuel industry. Oil companies saying, no, now oversupply is driving demand. We're going to keep demand up, even though electric vehicles are viable now. That's what they're trying to do to keep us hooked on fossil fuels. They're also doing that through the advertising. And we need to have these conversations a lot with our family, with our communities, in order to shift that power away from them. I think, and maybe this is my concluding comment because I have to go, is I think one of the most horrible things the fossil fuel industry has ever done is tried to steal our imagination, to imagine a world where we don't use them, to imagine a world where we're not dependent on fossil fuels. There's advertising in every major fossil fuel producing in the region, producing country that I've seen that says, you know, look, you have an iPhone, therefore you use plastics. Look, you know, what are you going to do in the hospital if you couldn't have an IV bag, etc. They fearmonger about price, about scarcity, and in that way, they hold our politics hostage. No, renewable energy is cheaper. It's more affordable, and it's not going to kill your kids by choking them with air pollution. Fossil fuels are the leading cause of premature death on the planet. 8 million people died last year due to air pollution related premature deaths. And that's not even looking at lethal heat or all the other causes of death. If we continue on the trajectory we're on, close to 1.5 billion people will lose their homes by 2050, predominantly because of fossil fuels and fossil fuel use. It's absurd to say that it will be more expensive and less affordable a life if we don't have as much fossil fuels. And that's the narrative that they're growing and that you're going to have to counter. But help people remember the sun is not going to send you a bill at the end of the month. They want us to be dependent on it because they want us to keep paying them. And that has to stop. Please join us in building a movement around the fossil fuel treaty. And whatever you decide to advocate for, keep being out in the streets. because our lives literally depend upon it. Thank you for inviting me to join me in your brilliant conference, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Tezpora. Really, really appreciate it. And getting a lot of love in the chat as well. Thank you so much for answering people's questions and for being here with us today. Just before everyone leaves, invite you to, if you're interested in getting involved, we're running a bunch of induction workshops in the next couple of weeks with Rev 21, Revolution in the 21st Century. So do sign up for those. Just put the chat in the link, rev21.earth/events. Thank you again. I really appreciate your presence here today. Many, many blessings. Bye for now. Bye, everybody.